Welcome to this introduction to using the meta model in coaching and in counselling. You'll notice that the subtitle there says Uncovering the Structure. This particular model for questioning and finding out about how somebody has put their version of their world together came from the very early days, right at the genesis of neurolinguistic programming. It's proved a particularly powerful way of thinking in terms of shaping our questions and listening for information and constructing our best model of the client's model of the world. And most importantly, it's a very, very powerful tool in terms of preventing us from projecting. Let's have a look at a model first that helps us understand why understanding some linguistic signals or terminology is important. This particular model is a very useful way of thinking about how our senses, sight, hearing, smell, taste, and body sensations, interrelate with language, which basically is a secondary form of processing information. So here we have somebody who's going about their business in the world, and if they have all senses functioning, they see something, and through the visual system we get some input, V, into the brain. They hear something through the auditory channels, and some of that signal reaches the brain. They may have body sensations both from the surface of the skin, what you would have heard referred to at school as the sense of touch, but also all those other things, the proprioceptive signals that help you with what muscle tension is like, the signals that tell you what state your stomachs are in, those things we give interesting names to, such as butterflies in the stomach if we're nervous about something, or kind of excitement inside. So all of those sensations we collectively lump into the representational system or the sense kinesthetic. We also have smell, or the olfactory system, and taste, the gustatory system. So we have 5 sets of sensory signals reaching the brain. Some of these will be noticed more than others, perhaps, and of course in some circumstances some may not be relevant. A lot of the times we're not paying much, certainly conscious attention to olfactory and gustatory, smell and taste, for example. But now let's look what happens with this. So we have this sensory coding of experience in our brain, and then we've invented this remarkable system called language. But it's not what we would call a primary system. Although the brain processes language, we actually have to use our sensory systems to make sense of the symbols that language are. So if you think about it, a word like chair, either written or said so that you hear it, is just a symbol for some sort of object that you have stored in your mind as what represents a chair. You learn you build up your store of language by early experience, where you walk around and your parents say, that's a chair, that's a table, that's the floor, here's your glass of milk, and with enough repetition your brain begins to recognize the sound symbols, and later on, of course, for most people, we learn the writing symbols, the written ones, as we're watching here. Similarly, if you use language, it has to evoke some form of sensory coding that you might have stored to make sense of it. So if somebody says, oh, that's a nice chair, you make sense of that language because you have some generic representation of what a chair is. Another good experience of that is if somebody comes to you and you're working away inside, let's imagine you've been working on assignment or some bookkeeping or some part of your business for some while, and you haven't noticed what the weather's like outside, and somebody comes in and says, hey, gosh, it's an absolutely fabulous day outside. What just came into your imagination? When I ask that question in front of training groups, most of the group will usually say, a bright sunny day with artistically placed clouds, blue sky, all of that kind of thing. Of course, if we've had a long hot dry spell, some people might say, oh, a nice misty rain day, but that's unusual for most people. So now let's have a look at this. We've got a sensory coding of experience. So let's suppose you go to a wonderful meal in a restaurant and you have a coding of what the restaurant looked like, a memory of the sound of the music, a memory also of the words and tones of conversations, how comfortable the atmosphere felt, what the chairs were like, and most particularly what the food and wine tasted like. If you gave a full description of that, we could call that what a deep structure. Now, this term comes from transformational grammar, which is an older form of grammar studies. There are new versions now, but the terminology is still very useful for our purposes here. So the definition of deep structure is the fullest possible linguistic description of the event, and the event is represented by the sensory coding of experience. However, unless you're one of those people who gives everybody every bit of detail, if somebody comes to you and asks you, what was your meal like in the restaurant the other night? You might say something like, it was fabulous, the food was great. You don't necessarily give them every bit of detail, and nor would they probably want it, because it could take as long as the restaurant experience was to do that. So we have what's called a surface structure. So you give out some of these details in your surface structure, and this is particularly useful in terms of saving time. Also, if you go back to a more evolutionary point of view, if you want to think about the times where we might have been traipsing around 200,000 years ago around the savannah, and I suppose we still had carnivorous marsupials wandering around, and one of these large creatures was charging towards us, we don't want to have to say, oh, there's a very large creature covered in dark brown hair with fierce-looking teeth and making loud grunting and growling noises running to us. We would just want to say, oh, there's a monster coming towards us, let's get out of here. So we've eliminated some information in uttering our surface structure. So between the deep structure and the surface structure, we have a number of different types of processes called transformations. And these will either make some generalizations. That's a chair, for example, rather than saying, oh, that's a 1950s style chair, or that's a nice, fabulous Louis XIV chair. We might make some generalizations. We can also delete a lot of information. This can be very useful in terms of describing the restaurant experience. And we might shift the meaning of some things. And you'll see later, or hear later, that this is called making distortions. So overall, when we utter our surface structure, or someone else says a surface structure to us, there's missing information. This is not such a bad thing in terms of day-to-day communication, but of course if we're in a business situation where information that might have been left out, deleted for example, or somebody's distorted the meaning of, that can be very important. It is of course particularly important when we're coaching somebody or counselling somebody and we want to be able to get a much richer idea of what's really going on, often outside their conscious awareness, in the way that they've constructed their world, so that when they report something like, oh, I've got a bad relationship, we don't just accept this static concept of a relationship and that it's working. We want to know actually what's going on. So typically what happens is we might read something or hear something, and all we're getting is the other person's surface structure. We're getting the information that has been transformed. We don't have the full representational experience, all the detail of what they saw, heard, felt, and possibly smelt and taste in that event. In our own mind, what has to happen is that we have to go looking for our own store of sensory coding of experience to try and make some sense of that. And then we'll find some sort of deep structure that might make sense to us. So if somebody says, oh, I'm having such a difficult time in my relationship at the moment, there's a temptation to go, oh, I know exactly what you mean. But the important question is, do you? What you know is what your brain means. Do you know what they mean? Unless they've given you all the details and you actually can imagine being in their existence and looking out through their eyes and ears and experiencing what they've been experiencing, you don't fully know what they mean. You may certainly have some idea. There are some general patterns in what people might call a good or a bad relationship, but the specifics can be very, very different from one set of circumstances to another. So the meta model was designed to help us learn how to focus on signals in language from our clients that we can store up, and over time use those signals to start to reconstruct how they've constructed their reality. And just this very model that you're looking at now that will remind you that when they say, oh, I'm having a challenging time at work, You might be able to guess accurately some of what might be happening, but you have to acknowledge that all you're hearing is their surface structure. To get some interpretation of it in the first instance, you rely on your stored experiences and your deep structures, your linguistic description of what the experience was. But to find out what they're experiencing, we may need to patiently ask a series, quite a long series in some cases, of questions until we can get enough information from what they're saying. Now, what happens with the meta model is that there are 12 linguistic signals that are really important clues for us to note what somebody says, and which may prompt, or certainly prompt, questions in our head, and that we can use to guide the way we question our clients. So the meta model is about recovering the following things: deleted information, information that's been generalized, something like, oh, that type of job is always difficult, or these kinds of movies are always fun. That might be generally true, but is it always true? And things that get changed. An example I'll use later on, which I think explains it well, is, oh, I know this guy Fred, he's fantastic and he's obviously enlightened. He eats bananas. Now that is a distortion in language. There's no logical connection between eating bananas and being enlightened. But the structure of that lack of logic is exactly the same as, oh, he's a senior manager, he must be really intelligent. There's not necessarily a logical connection. Fortunately, there often is that correlation, but one thing doesn't necessarily guarantee the other. So there will be 12 linguistic distinctions in helping us go, oh, there's some deleted information, or there's something that's perhaps been overgeneralized, or there's something where the meaning has been shifted, or there's a belief statement that really needs to be paid attention to. Aside from the 12 linguistic signals that will highlight those processes to us, there are also the underlying presuppositions in language, and we'll talk about those right at the end of this presentation. So the meta model is about recovering these things and finding patterns and connections. In other words, we're looking for how is the person creating their model of the world. Let's look at an example. So here's somebody says, when I get this job, I'll be happy. That's the sort of thing that people say every day. We go, oh, okay, that's fine. Well, that's nice. But let's look at some of the things that we've got in here. Well, here's a bit of a prelude on presuppositions. First of all, there's the presupposition or the assumption that they'll get the job. That may or may not be accurate. And we can see some points to consider here. Just noticing that when somebody says, when I get this job, tells us that they're presupposing that they'll get it. There's an expectation, there's a belief they're capable of it, and there's a perception that others will believe they're capable and worthy of the job. There's another issue here. We don't yet know what the job is. So if we're working with someone, we go, oh, okay, we've got some missing information here. Does the person have the knowledge and skills required? Implies the person believes they have the knowledge and skills. How does the job fit with their values? These are things that as a coach or a counsellor we might want to consider and may or may not become relevant later on in the questioning. It's just the kinds of things that you start to notice when you really start to notice just how many clues are coming towards us in what people say, and particularly when you combine that with their non-verbal communication. And then we've got this important cause effect, that getting the job will cause them to be happy. That is, it'll be the cause of the effect of being happy. Really interesting stuff to know here. How is it that getting that particular job will result in them being happy? What are their criteria for being happy? Do they have that even well constructed in a healthy kind of way? And so on. If you want to read more of these in detail, just simply pause the slides here. So overall, we've got an interesting thing where we've got what we call a cause-effect relationship. That's the pattern in the whole sentence. Getting the job means that there are certain aspects of the job which will satisfy the person's criteria for being happy. So there's a number of things that just that one sentence highlight. There's the presupposition they'll get the job. It implies that they believe that they've got the skills for the job. We know they must have criteria for being happy, but we don't yet know what they are. And we will be investigating whether the job itself will actually satisfy those criteria in the way they think it will. A question that might pop into our heads, we often won't ask it this way, but the question that we might ask in our heads is this one. How specifically? You can ask that at times, but it's often very good to have other ways of asking that question. How exactly is this job going to be helping you? What is it about the job that you really like, that makes you feel happy, and so forth. The key to using the meta model as a questioning guide is to know the linguistic distinctions. Personally, I argue strongly for the case of knowing the labels of them. And I rush to add here that while you're working with somebody, you won't be busy thinking, oh, that was a cause effect, that was a complex equivalent, that was a simple deletion, that was a nominalization. There isn't time for that. That would be cognitive overload. But if you want to question how you've got to some conclusion or some inference about what's going on in the person's mind, then being able to backtrack through what they've said, or perhaps even listen to a tape and go, that cause effect or that complex equivalent statement that they made indicated an underlying belief, and that showed up later on in a lost performative. Now, I've just used a lot of jargon, by the way, but of course I'm going to tell you what these terms mean. So my encouragement to you is to actually get to really know these linguistic distinctions, these particular labels, and know plenty of examples of them in language, so that when we start to see the connections between them, then it's easier for you to understand how it is that you arrived at your inferences regarding those connections. So these are the 12 labels, and to help manage cognitive load, we're just going to look at one at a time, because we want to be able to recognize them, to generate them, to question them, and to be able to detect the patterns in them over short and long-term time frames. And of course, we want to be able to ask meta-model questions. That is, question those things using not the labels back to the client, but be able to question the structure of what the client's saying. Let's start with the easiest one. Now, at this point here, we're going to go through all 12. If you need a break, this is a good place to take a break, or you might take a break after each column. And a follow-up video will also show how some of these might be used more in a conversation and how the coach can actually use them and in their own mind to start to reconstruct what's going on. First of all, there's a simple deletion, and it's labelled that because there is simply information missing. I would add, by the way, as we go through these, notice how the labels for these linguistic phenomena actually tell you what they mean. So a simple deletion is simply deleting information. So someone walks into the room and says, I'm worried. What do you naturally want to know? Most people say, about what or what's worrying you, but the short version of that question that you can hear in your head is about what? Until somebody tells us an answer, could be the economy, could be what they did last night, your exams, what was in a tablet they took at some party, the future, how to learn, their career, any number of things. So basically, we haven't got all the rest of the sentence. I'm worried about my in-laws coming next weekend. I'm worried about going for my performance review tomorrow. I'm worried about whether there's going to be a crash in the housing market, etc. By the way, you will notice that most of these examples are taken from a counselling style of situation, but it's also good to think as we go through, and I'll say some, even though they're not printed on screen, of good ones. So if somebody walks in and says, oh, hey, I'm really excited, once again, we're probably going to go, oh, what about? What's actually happening? What's occurring that's helping you be excited? Then there's an unspecified referential index. This is also sometimes referred to in the older books as a lack of referential index. A referential index is something that refers to something. So all our pronouns do that. He, she, they. It. It also can be words like that, and sometimes it's terms like that meeting was annoying. So that meeting, we don't know which meeting's being referred to, so technically we can think of that as an unspecified referential index. Let's look at an example on screen. They'll be here tomorrow. Well, we don't know who they are. Who will? And it could be any number of these things. Often these are quite inconsequential, and often we will know who they are from context. If I said, oh, the auditors are coming to review our business processes, they'll be here tomorrow, we obviously know who they be. But if someone sits down and says, oh, I'm so worried about that person I'm working with, which person in particular, that person in that moment then is an unspecified referential index. Then there's a comparative deletion. So this is where the information for about how a comparison is being made is being deleted. So she's much better for the job. So we might be comparing two people for a job. Might be Jan and Jim, for example, and I'm saying she's much better for the job, but you might want to know in what way specifically. Well, you already know is better than Jim, but if I just said, oh, Jan is much better for the job, you'd be quite within your rights to say, well, better than whom? And also, we have no idea what the criteria are for the comparison here. Is that because she's got more qualifications, a better personality, etc.? Then as we go through these, you'll notice the type and amount of information that can be missing can become more significant. So now we have unspecified verbs and adverbs. Have you ever heard anybody saying, we'll do that easily? Now, if that's true, that's great, but how specifically? How do we know we'll be able to do that easily? We might be talking about a project at work. We might be able to talk about, I've got to have this performance review with my one of the people reporting to me. I've got to give them some corrective feedback, but I'll be able to do that easily, your client says to you. And you could think to yourself, well, that's nice to know. Now, how specifically, and let's check how easily. Is it because you've already got the skills? And if it's a different type of project, or a different type of issue, if people have forgotten about something, is the job 3/4 finished already? Now, we're not questioning whether this is true or not. We're simply going, how specifically in our minds to remind us that we actually don't know what the criteria are for doing something easily. We don't know what's in place already. We don't know if the person's view of doing something easily in a given time frame is realistic or not at this stage. So when you hear something like do easily, you go, oh, that's an unspecified verb. You notice that could be helpful or it might be unhelpful in some circumstances. Even something like, oh, come to the movies. Tonight we're going to see Star Wars version 28. That'll be fun. Will be fun is an unspecified verb. Great if that's true. And you might go, oh, okay. How will it be fun specifically? If you just wanted to worry your friends. But you do need to be careful of these questions with your friends and relatives. Best not, most times. And the last one of the deletions is the nominalizations. Now, these are a particularly mischievous form of words, and Steven Pinker is one of the top cognitive scientists in the world, and he's got a great book out called The Sense of Style. He's also available on some podcasts. He refers to them as zombie nouns, basically because they don't tell you much. They're words we love, and by the way, they can often be labels for what's important to us. So they're not bad words per se, but there are times where the lack of information associated with them and the assumptions that they cause to be made are particularly mischievous. So we need to improve our relationship. By the way, notice that improve is an unspecified verb, just to highlight that before we get to the word relationship. So We would ask how specifically, but what's grabbing our attention probably most in this sentence is the word relationship. So it's a noun, it's an abstract noun, but it refers to a process. So there are abstract nouns like, I had a great idea. That's an abstract noun, but it's not necessarily a process. Whereas a relationship is something that requires two or more people, generally speaking, or at least two or more voices in the same head. So we need to improve our relationship. One of the things that can happen unconsciously is because it's a static term and it's treated linguistically as an object here, people can become dissociated from it in a way that removes their sense of influence or power over it, and even sometimes their sense of responsibility. So we want to ask a question in a way that gets them back to thinking about actions. So how specifically would you improve how you are relating would be a powerful question in many cases. What will we do to relate better? What are some things we could do to improve the way we are relating? Would we, for example, turn the TV off 3 nights a week? Would we talk to each other differently, in a different tone of voice? So these types of questions, once you see a word like relationship, then we can often be very important to go, okay, we need to get the person thinking about the processes of relating, particularly if they're complaining about the situation. If somebody says, I have a great relationship, which people do, you must say, oh, fantastic. What are some of the things that you do that create this ongoing experience of it being great? Other nominalizations are words like, in business, efficiency, productivity. An interesting one is the economy. There's no such thing as the economy. The economy is the result of all the ongoing processes in society. In day-to-day life, other nominalizations are words like appreciation, love, affection, fun, enthusiasm, excitement. You'll notice all of these things can be great states of being. They're often our values, but if you want to know what happiness is like, you can't buy happiness by the kilo. What are your criteria for being happy? What sort of things are happening when you are in the process of being happy, for example? So that's our deletions. Simple deletion, unspecified referential index, comparative deletion, unspecified verbs and adverbs. You obviously know what an unspecified adverb is, and nominalizations. Then there are generalizations. A very straightforward one is the universal quantifier. Something like it's always the same thing around here. So always is universal, saying it's happening every time. So the prompt question you'll hear in your head is, always? Is it always the same? Or are there never any exceptions to this every time, on every single occasion? I used to use this a lot in customer service. We know we'd get a client ringing in and saying, I always have trouble every time I ring this company, and if there's an opportunity to help them realise that there have actually been some times when they've had successful encounters with the company's customer service, it's good to help them undo this belief that it's always a bad thing. So other universal quantifiers are things like no one's listening to me. Every time I go to a movie with these friends, that's fantastic. So that's a good one. But every time? Oh, well, I want to hang out with those friends if that's the case. Never. Then modal operators of necessity about things that have to be done or must be done, and they are often expressions of rules or even beliefs. So it has to be done that way. Now that might be the case, but many people, I think probably fair to say most people, have experienced something where people are saying it has to be done that way, when in fact there is another more effective way. So, and we might say, what if we didn't? What makes that the best way to find out if that's a justified claim? Who says? No other options. So when I try to do it, give it home, let's suppose I've got someone coming for counselling or coaching and says, I'm just missing out on my friends, I've got a single parent and so many Friday nights or Saturday nights. I'm the one who has to stay home and look after my little sister. Oh, okay, we might think, oh, well, that's a shame. Just out of interest, how old is your little sister? Our next response will be very different for these two answers. If the person says, well, she's only 3, so it might be fair that the person has to look after that if they can't find a babysitter. She said, well, I don't know, she's 23, so I don't know why my mum says I still have to stay home and look after her. I'm only 2 years older. So does the person have to stay home and look after their little sister in that instance? So it has to be done that way. Listen for the rules that people say, I have to do this, I must do that, where those things might be restricting their options or limiting their choices about what's available to them. And the other modal operator is one of possibilities about what can be done, which is often good, but it also includes the ones about what can't be done. We couldn't do it that way. Now, once again, this is not to challenge everything that people say, but we might go, oh, so what's stopping us? Specifically, what would happen if we did do it that way, if it's possible to do it a different way? Has anyone tried it that way? So again, it's about exploring choice, exploring options, and working out what the beliefs are that have somebody say we couldn't do it that way. It might be perfectly reasonable, but then again, sometimes we might want to go, okay, well, have you considered that it could be more effective to do it in this other way, whatever the it is? Might be something as simple as budgeting or some time management processes or some simple assertiveness practice, for example. So that's our second column. Remember, if you need a break to absorb this, because there's a fair bit of information in a short time, here's a good spot to take a break before we look at the distortions. But there are only 4 of those. So here we have the first distortion, and these get fun. Lost performatives, we've lost who the performer is. In other words, we don't know who said the statement. So something like, you can't trust people who wear green hats. Now, I've tried to make this humorous so it won't be too contentious, but you can imagine how people say these sorts of things about different cultural groups, different sections in a particular business, people who have a particular look. So you can't trust people who wear green hats. And the thing about a lost performative, it's generally a culturally held belief, something we've picked up from grandparents and parents, from our schools, for people who go to churches, maybe from their churches, from social groups. Might be something you've developed and you've forgotten why you developed it, but somewhere along the line you have just absorbed it and it's just become a base guideline for a way of approaching life. So you can imagine here, if you can't trust people with green hats, what happens every time you see somebody who's wearing a green hat? Now this might be relatively, hopefully humorous, this one, but think about it. You can't trust any managers. So what's going to happen to that person's work life if somebody has that as a culturally held belief? You'll notice that also you can't trust is also a modal operator of possibility. So you start to see now there are a number of things in these sentences. So when we say according to whom, who says? And our object, with rapport and when appropriate only, is to have the person question these kinds of rules. There are some good lost performatives, some good rules. Always look to the right, to the left, and to the right again when crossing the road, when you're in a country where we drive on the left-hand side of the road. There are certain types of spiders in Sydney that if you see those, always be very careful with them. So that's a useful generalization always, and it's also a good lost performative. What we'll be looking for in coaching and counselling particularly are the ones that, once again, are limiting people's options and their choices about what's available to them and perhaps affecting the way they judge other people and therefore interact with them. Then there's the cause effects. We saw one early at the beginning of this video. When I get that job, I'll be happy. That might be true, but let's examine it. You often hear it in these kinds of things. You made me, or that person made me so angry. Now, because of the way the older part of the brain, the limbic system, works, we can make somebody angry momentarily, but people can also learn to control that reaction through development of their emotional intelligence, simply stopping and taking a deep breath and letting the more evolved part of their brain offer more sophisticated and more appropriate responses. So, particularly if somebody's prolonging anger after an event or embarrassment or sadness, we might think how specifically, but we may want to know what specifically was it that the person did that has resulted in you feeling this anger. And if you've got enough rapport, and you do have to have enough rapport for this version, so when the person did whatever they did, how was it that you made yourself angry? Because the anger, the actual emotional response, lives in the person with the anger or the excitement. The intent of this kind of questioning is to once again guide people towards the awareness that they can learn to control much of their emotional responses, particularly where these are unhelpful emotional responses, and accept responsibility for them, and also to learn to use the information from their responses to guide more sophisticated and more enabling states of mind and states of operation. Of course, if somebody comes in with a good one like, "Oh, you made me so happy the other day," just go, "Oh, fantastic. Oh, what was it I did?" so I can do it again sometime. And then there's complex equivalent. I gave you one of these earlier. He's bananas. He's obviously enlightened. Completely ridiculous. There's no connection between eating bananas and being enlightened. However, we could challenge that if somebody did believe it with these kinds of questions. And this type of question is aimed at breaking the apparent connection between these. But we could say, look, he's obviously going to be great for the job. He's got 2 MBAs. Now, one would hope that having 1 or 2 MBAs would help a person be good for a job, but it doesn't guarantee it. So again, the job here is to go, actually, how is the person making these connections, and how is the connection a useful one? Where could that connection get somebody into a misreading of a situation or into trouble, or is it actually a useful one? So a useful one, for example, is like, oh, I actually managed to learn a little bit about FileMaker database last night. I obviously am able to learn. If your client says something like that, you go, yes, indeed, you can. So that behavior does mean that you can learn, and it's good evidence that you can learn. So what you'll see in a complex equivalent is that an observation of an event or some behavior, and the person turns around and is basically saying it means this or is equal to this. That's why it's called a complex equivalence, or sometimes written as a complex equivalent. Listen for good ones, listen for bad ones. And you can also hear there that they can't make that connection between eating bananas and obviously being enlightened unless there's some underlying rule or belief. Oh, people who eat bananas are enlightened. So where did that belief come from? And that's where you start to map the structure of somebody's world. Last one, mind reading, and you know what this is. But of course, depending on the situation, one might say, exactly how do you know what I'm thinking? On what evidence? So people go, oh my gosh, my boss has called me in for a meeting suddenly. I know I'm in trouble. Well, on what basis would you know that? They might be calling you in to congratulate you on something, or simply to ask your advice, or to get some figures from you. So how specifically do we know these things? So there are our 12 linguistic distinctions that as we get more and more used to them, they signal things in what we read, and particularly what people say, that give us clues for where we may want to go in the questioning to understand how they link things. I think the best example to go back to at the moment is something like, oh, she's got an MBA, she's obviously going to be good as a senior manager. We would hope that might be true, but keep in mind that just having an MBA does not guarantee that somebody's going to be good at a senior manager. Being a senior manager involves a whole range of skills like rapport skills, systems thinking skills, budgeting skills, project management skills often, meeting running skills, general communication skills. So just having an MBA does not guarantee that. We would hope it would help facilitate it, but it doesn't guarantee it. The last little bit of this is just pointing to listen to what in sentences that aren't covered by any of those 12 distinctions, but still might be important. This is a fairly ordinary sentence, where we're looking at the presuppositions in language, so this is what has to be assumed to be true for the sentence to make sense. So the sentence Sam drove here today does not make any sense at all unless we presuppose that one, Sam is able to operate a vehicle. Notice we can't assume he drives well, or we can't even assume he has a license. It doesn't say that, but if he started somewhere else and got here in a car or some sort of vehicle, he must be able to operate it to some extent. Sam had access to a vehicle, and Sam was somewhere else at the beginning of the day. So even a simple sentence like that presupposes three underlying things for it to make sense. Now that's a fairly meaningless sentence in many ways, but if somebody says something like, I know my boss doesn't like me, and that they're going to give me a terrible roasting next week. There's a lot of things in there we could question. I know my boss doesn't like me, that's mind reading, but there's the presupposition as well that the boss doesn't like them. And I know they're going to give me a roasting, so there's a presupposition that there's going to be a meeting next week and that it's going to be an unpleasant one. Once again, it involves some mind reading, but we might question what they mean by a roasting, which in this case is a nominalization. But it's more important that they're actually just assuming that there's going to be an unpleasant event next week, and that's where your awareness of the presuppositions or the underlying assumptions in language can also be very helpful at times. That's a lot of information indeed to cover in one term. Please review this video and think about the terms involved, start listening for these distinctions in language, and a follow-up video will have a mock coaching session where the client will say some things and the coach might notice them, and we'll see how the meta model can guide the coach's questioning.